Welcome to Idea to Impact. I'm glad to have you here, and I hope you'll forgive me. I have this wonderfully written script of all the things I was supposed to tell you today, and it's well scripted and sitting on my desk over at the Greenville Center, so we are going to wing it today, but I promise you it's going to be good. Our first session in the year really talked about the innovation process and why it's important for a variety of different reasons, and helping to promote the research and scholarly activities here on campus, and ultimately to produce improved economy for Eastern North Carolina. Our second session, we had a great turnout, great speakers, and we talked about two key points in the second session. One is, when you have an idea, you need to be very thorough in exploring that idea and to decide how valid is it really. And sometimes, the second point is, sometimes we need to reach out to other people to kind of look at our idea and to give us some objective feedback. So maybe our idea is good and could use a little bit more work. Maybe sometimes our idea is not so good and we should go find, don't give up our day job is what we should do. But so today our focus is, so now we've kind of refined our ideas, whether it's research or a product or whatever it is we're working on, and the key is, now you need to continue to move on it, and how do you do that without money? Money is important. So we thought today would be a good session to talk about various sources of money to help us move our projects forward. And we've got a wonderful panel. I'm very excited about the folks that we have here today that can speak from a variety of different angles and different resources for funding support. So join me in welcoming our panel. First we have Ernie Marshburn, who is the Director of the Office of Research Development with the Division of Research and Economic Development. Ernie has a well-established career in writing and receiving large federal grant awards for here at ECU that cover a variety of different things. Next to Ernie, we have Mike Carnes, who's a technology counselor with the Small Business Technology Development Center. And in that role, Mike focuses his attention on university inventors, university clients, and small business clients who have a technology that could be produced as a product or a business. So he's more skilled in funding from investors, and also has great knowledge about small federal grants for small businesses, SBIR and STTR grants. So we're glad to have Mike. Next we have Sharon Hamilton, who is our Senior Director of the Office of Corporate and Foundation Relations here at ECU. I should say she's the founding director of the office, because she founded that office when she came here. But Sharon's focus is working with faculty to explore and obtain grant funding from foundations and corporations, which is a little bit of a different animal and a different method in approaching for those. And then last but not least, we have my very good friend Rob Lindberg, who's the Vice President of Science and Technology Development at the North Carolina Biotechnology Center. Now, Rob is definitely in the life science field, but he sort of straddles the line between more traditional scholarly grants for biotech and the business side of things, because he's served on both sides of that role at the Biotech Center. So through the center, he has led programs that provided loans and investment capital to small business, more biotech related, and in his current role, more on the grant side of the house. So I think we've got a very good program for you. I'm trying to remember what my script would say, and one of the things it would say is, it is a reminder, the format here is a very casual chat that will talk about these different models of funding. And we will do that for about 30 minutes. And after that, we're going to follow that up with Q&A. Now, because we're being recorded, I'm going to ask you to take advantage. On your tables, you should find some note cards and pencils. So if you could write your questions on the cards, and when it's time for Q&A, just hand the cards to one of my staff members. If you all can raise your hands at the back of the room, we have Diana, Carlisle, and Lucretia, and they'll pass those cards to me, and I'll read the questions off. And then following that comes the really fun part. Not that this isn't fun. This is very fun. But the fun part is if you will either sit at the table that fits your discipline, and we're going to start to go through some exercises to help refine your pitches. We call it a pitch in my field, and how you would make your approach in looking for funding or talking with someone. So I think it's going to be a very good program. I can't think anything else to say, so off script, I'm going to turn it over to our established panel, and Ernie, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you again. Yeah, one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about at the university is not just concept development, but the value proposition that goes along with it. And I can put that in context of faculty that we work with, and I think that I would say that our faculty are as good or better than any faculty matched up against any university in the country. But at the same time, one of the things that we have to instill within the faculty is a sense that in order to be competitive within this market, particularly now, you have to have a creative and a unique idea. It's not enough simply to repurpose your research as you may have envisioned it. It's a matter of marketing that research to a particular agency and ensuring that you meet the goals, objectives, priorities of that agency. It may be in addition to that, thinking about it from the standpoint that perhaps there's some deliverable that you're offering that is synergistic, that makes the result bigger than the proposal itself. So perhaps, Mike, from your perspective, how would you view that concept, both of development and value proposition?
You know, it is always important to start thinking about the value proposition early and often. And when you think about value proposition, you know, there should be 4 things that you're thinking about right up front. First is, what is the problem that I'm solving? So who has that problem? So that would be your potential customer. Thinking about how your technology is a potential solution to their problem. And then lastly, how is that technology better than anything else that's on the marketplace? So who's your leading competitor and how's it better? And you know, as you're thinking about those things, those are really the foundation for your business case and what you're going to use to really build your fundraising strategy. And it's essential that you know those components before you go out trying to raise capital.
Sharon, what about from corporate and foundational relations?
Well, when I talk about receiving draft proposals from faculty, it is a little bit of a different world when you're going to a corporation or foundation. So our faculty have wonderful project ideas, but they're after things that will help them advance their research and advance their project ideas. But one of the things you have to turn around and do when you're approaching a corporation or foundation is they are not going to fund something that you want to do, okay? They're going to fund something that you're doing that is going to help them reach their mission and goals. And it's a very common thing for me to get a proposal to cross my desk where the faculty is very eloquent about what it is they want to do. But it's all about how it's going to help East Carolina University or how it's going to help their research portfolio or how it's going to help them. And what we have to do in our office is turn that around and say, okay, this corporation or foundation you're going to approach, how is it that what you're doing is going to help them? And it's a tweak and it's a different way of looking at things. So we have something where we will sit down with faculty and coach them because companies are going to fund the things they care about. And we spend a lot of time on making that fit of your project with the particular funder.
Makes great sense. Rob?
Sure, thank you, Ernie. certainly would agree with everything said by Sharon and Mike so far. Note that in this rubric of how to position your research, nowhere was it mentioned the bright, shiny object, really ultra cool aspect of your research and your science. You as faculty know, competing for grants, that the most competitive grant really doesn't shine a light solely on the technology. It also suggests tractable applications of that technology. As you and there's a peer review aspect there as you start marching through other early commercialization programs. Mike may speak on the federal SBIR grants, certainly for Biotech Center funding. Usually where the federal government or ourselves or similar funding groups jump in is kind of vetting that pre-commercialization potential and helping sift and see if a project, a technology, and innovation is likely to have legs there. The Biotech Center years ago got out of funding basic science, and so we're jumping in at a point trying to help develop traction towards a solution for very specific problems. That's news to a lot of academic researchers, and I would say our business group, 2/3 of the loans they've made historically have been to university spin-outs, so pretty familiar with that dynamic. These are situations where the science has been peer-reviewed over and over again, but the commercial prospects for technologies emanating from that science may never have been pressure tested beyond just a hypothetical guess at an application. That simply doesn't cut it anymore. That's going to be demanded by any funding agency, any strategic partner, any investor. I think Sharon made a great point. You really have to understand what drives your different partners, whether it's collaborators, whether it's grant funders, loan funders, angel or venture capital. Everybody, corporate and foundations in particular, they have an agenda. They're measured on something, and you may or may not overlap with them for some period of the evolution of your technology. It won't be forever, but you want to synergize for a period of time. But you really have to understand how they're measured and what drives them, what gets them up out of bed and position yourself as a fit there.
So I think what I'm hearing is a reliance or to make certain that you're in a close match between the agency priorities and goals, and that's an important component of ensuring that you have the most competitive type proposal to move forward. But I'd like to dig just a little bit deeper, and we don't have to go through a line. I'd just like to hear your thoughts. In my world, I spend a lot of time with the Department of Defense or the National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health. And it's not enough simply to be sure that you match an agency goal or an agency priority, although that's a critical element. It's important that you be unique or creative in the way you approach it. So for example, if I was a submission and there were 100 more just like mine that went in for review, then I'm not sure how the agency would view mine as compared to them, as opposed to if I were to come up with an innovative approach or methodology for approaching that same subject and submitted it so that I'm unique, and then you had 99 more that were all just alike, then to me, I have a competitive advantage. Is there anything to this idea of having some uniqueness associated with your concept?
Yeah, I think it's obvious, it's a necessity. And when you think about different funding mechanisms, that novelty, that uniqueness versus competing technologies is going to be critical. No matter what funding strategy you're using, equity capital, meaning going out selling a portion of your business to investors, or whether or not you're raising grant funding. And with grant funding, obviously you're going to have the agencies that have some overarching goals as an agency. But depending on the agency you're looking for commercialization funding they may be more or less specific on what their goals actually are. So if you're familiar with the national SBIR and STTR programs, those are large federal grant programs. They're two-phase programs. Generally, the first phase is anywhere from $150,000 to $225,000 that those funds are used for demonstrating feasibility of a product idea, whereas the second phase is generally anywhere from $750,000 to $1.5 million to go ahead and go out and do a more robust prototyping, kind of field testing of your product idea. So those programs are vary slightly between agencies, and what you'll see is that some agencies, like Department of Defense, they're going to say, we're looking for a solution and very clearly outline a contract of exactly what they're looking for. Whereas other agencies like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, they're going to be more broad in the way they present those topics to the business community. And what that means is not only do you have to understand how you fit into their overall objectives, but you also need to be able to come to them and say, we have a very unique, innovative, high-risk way of solving this problem. And we've also identified potential customers in the marketplace who would be interested in buying this product should we get it ready for commercialization. So that I think it's critical that you balance all those parts, and that at an early stage you're working on all those parts simultaneously to make sure that your message is clear when you approach those agencies.
Excellent. Well, let's take that one step further. I think what I'm hearing you say is not just a matter of having a solid concept, a good plan, a great match with priorities, and also a selling point, if you will. But again, from my perspective, and Sharon, this may be different from a corporate perspective, but from my perspective, it's very important that you match up what your needs are, not with money that's available, but with the objectives or the right match, if you will, for the program. For example, there are a number of faculty that I've worked with over the years that come in very excited about a particular program, and after you talk with them about it, it's less about the program than the fact that this program is offering $1.5 million in funding, and I need to go after that. I need to have my share of this funding. And the scenario that we've always tried to paint is that those individuals that solely pursue the funding are much less successful than those who identify they first of all develop a competitive concept and try to match that concept up with a compatible program that's a close fit, and then work toward that particular program. How about on the corporate side?
We get a lot of questions from faculty about which comes first. Do I have the idea and then you look for the funding, or is there funding and then I try to develop a project? I much prefer having a project that you're already working on, that you're very passionate about, that you want funding for. That is a much better scenario. Then when you go and we identify a possible fit for your project, then we can tweak certain things. Because there are some foundations who won't fund salary, or there are some foundations that won't fund travel. So we will look at your budget and decide, which funder is better for you. Getting to your point about being competitive, I tell people, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. They all have different rules. They all have different ways of doing business. And so it's very, very important that when you have a competitive idea that you want to shop around, that you talk to the foundation and see, do they want evidence-based programs? There are some that will say, we want to make sure that this kind of project works, and what is the evidence for that, and then, where are we going to expand your project? Or there might be one that want that novel aspect. Regardless of what they want, whether evidence-based or something completely unique, there is one common thread, and that is that, grant seeking is a contact sport. So I rarely, if ever, unless it's in the guidelines that says do not contact this foundation, and there are some national foundations that only want you to go in online. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, I'm going to work with the faculty member to make some pre-proposal contact with that funder. Because, them involving them up front is going to save you a lot of time if they're really not interested and it's not a good fit, or they're going to get so excited by your project that they're going to help you bake it. So we always talk to a funder when that opportunity exists before we ever go any further. One of the wonderful things with corporations and foundations, and increasingly they're doing this, is they have letter of intent opportunities or a letter of inquiry where you can actually do a 2-pager about what your idea is, send it to them, and then get invited to do a proposal so that you're not going to have to go through all that work of writing a proposal only to have it turned down. Mm-hmm. And I find that if you do the letter of inquiry and you get their feedback, I can pretty much look down my list of things that we've submitted and tell you which ones I'm, pretty confident we're going to get funded because I've talked to the funder. I know what it is they want. We make those adjustments in the proposal. And so when it goes in, it's got better than a 70% chance of being funded. Everybody's busy. We don't want to waste people's time. And so one of the most important things you can do is make that contact with that corporation or foundation to see what it is they're looking for.
And that's going to be the same scenario whether it's going after federal funding from a federal agency or if you're going after equity investment. I mean, it's all about relationship building. You don't go into a relationship asking someone to marry you. You're going to date first. It's an important part of the process. And so it's great that you have resources here on campus that can help you do that. And there are other resources in the state that can help you approach other organizations as well. So you have to take advantage and don't underestimate the importance of that relationship building period. It's voice of customer, understanding what they want.
That's an excellent point. Rob, maybe we could approach this from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. Since you're working at an in-state agency with North Carolina Biotech, mm-hmm. there are a number of faculty that I've run across that maybe don't perceive themselves to be as competitive at ECU as a colleague, pick a university, Duke or a Carnegie Mellon or somewhere else. And so the philosophy that they're working with is that rather than going for the big grants, what I'll do is apply for a small grant. And my chances of being more competitive in that realm are better. Or conversely, and this to me is somewhat worse, if you look at a large grant program and under budget for that program, the philosophy is that if I ask for less, I'm more competitive than someone who asks for more money. Now, typically we try to dissuade that sort of thinking. What about
as would we? So with the Biotech Center, and I imagine this is probably true for many agencies, we don't get extra points for only funding Duke, Carolina, and state opportunities, okay? No, actually, to the counter, we want to see our impact. We're funded by the state. This is taxpayer dollars at work. We want to have impact statewide. So if anything, we're, without changing where the bar is set, we absolutely welcome and we'll work with investigators, or we actually have a grant to tech transfer offices, work with Marty and her in Carlisle and the office there. And the same is true for companies outside the triangle. We may dig in a little bit more and roll up our sleeves a little bit more to help them be more competitive. Good science is good science. That's the foundation. One of the things, reacting to a comment you made, a point you made earlier, Ernie, in terms of chasing money
right.
because it's there. One of it, implied in there is sort of the culture difference between academia and industry. And by industry here, I'm talking more the earlier stage, oftentimes universities spin out companies. You know, in your academic lives, very often you've made it to a certain level of success because you've been able to react to what's going on in science or borrow from other areas of science and make pivots, make changes in your direction as the data suggests that you should. That is a tremendous thing in academia. That is typically going to be counterproductive if you're looking at taking that same underlying science, committing it to a technology, committing that technology to an application. There, focus and persistence is going to be your friend. If you chase, and we've seen this many times, by the way, if you chase federal SBIR grants, and those are available to companies, not to academic researchers per se. If you chase those grants, if you chase our funding simply because, well, we could do that, let's go over here, we could do that, we could go over, you know, what becomes very clear is you don't have a vision. You're not making net progress, you know, down a path that you've determined you want to go to. That may not be obvious to some funding agencies, but by the time you get to angel and venture investment, that's a deal killer. They need the commitment. Not that things don't change or you might see more commercial opportunity in a related application, one area of oncology versus another, or one food crop versus another, perhaps. But you know, lack of focus is what is the early death knell for many academic startups, companies.
So, and I'd like to hear from all of you on this, but let's think about it strategically, and perhaps, you know, this is one way to look at it. If I look at or talk to faculty, in many cases who are concerned about writing that big proposal, one of the comments I make, and that this is what I'm asking for you to react to, is that it is just as hard to write a small proposal or a big proposal, depending on your perspective. And I guess the analogy to that is a number of friends who are bankers or big bankers and tell me that they'll only accept those individuals who will make contributions in the millions of dollars. And my question is, well, what about the small investor? And their comment is, you know, I spend just as much time on all of my accounts, regardless of size. And so if I'm going to invest my time wisely, I might as well invest in the big money. That's the same analogy that I use in many cases with the faculty to say that don't be afraid to pursue the larger projects, because you'll find by and large that you'll spend just as much time on the small ones as you do on the large ones.
In the life sciences, the vast majority of things that we touch are going to require equity, institutional type investment, typically venture capital, because of the dollar amounts involved to take something to market, and typically a series of investments, usually from different combinations of investors at each stage. And what we've seen time and time again as when venture capitalists are asked, well, why wouldn't you fund my opportunity? It's only going to cost you $500,000, and you don't have to sink $5 or $10 or $50 million into it early on. Exactly your point, Ernie. The response will be, look, we're going to sink as much time. We're going to have to travel. We're going to have to talk to other partners because they're building their own relationships for the next step, the next stage of investment, a partnership with a corporation, whatever the goal line looks like for your opportunity. They're going to spend just as much time. They might as well do it for opportunities where they've sunk a significant amount of money into it, therefore their return is going to be similarly significant to them.
Thank you. Sharon, from a corporate and foundation perspective, would you say that there's any difference between your investment in a large project versus a small one?
we get requests all over the board from faculty. You know, we'll work with people who want a $25,000 pilot project to get started. And that's typically one of the things that we see with faculty that will then go on to Rob or Mike's group, is somebody who wants to get data to prove, you know, a proof of concept to then move forward. You know, we take all comers. You know, it depends. Obviously, it does take as much time to do a $25,000 proposal as it does a $250,000 proposal, but we meet the folks where they're at. What I always tell faculty is ask for what you need, and then we'll match you up with the proper funder. You know, I hate when I get a proposal where the funder is offering up to $100,000 and someone's asking for 35. You know, sometimes we call it little skinny grant syndrome. We want people to think a little bit bigger and see, you know, what they might add to this project to make it a little bit bigger. But again, ask for what you need. Most funders will tell you that. They'll have, you know, you can look at their history of grants to see what the size of them are, so you can make sure you're not over asking or under asking. But again, it's all part of that pre-proposal contact with the funder. We don't go to a funder where we don't ask, you know, is this in the ballpark? Is this budget something that you would do? Sometimes we get the good news that, you know, we really would like to see you do this in more places. We'll give you more money for that. I would also like to say you also, you know, have to have some skin in the game, even as a university. So, you know, you're going to have to go to a funder and you're going to have to be very committed to this project, that you want to do this project whether they give you the money or not. And so you're not going to go and get the whole thing.
You know, I'd like to echo that comment, having sat on both sides of this equation, both from proposal support and development, assisting faculty, and also on, in particular with the National Science Foundation, on review panels. There are many colleagues that I've sat with on the review panels that will focus on either the abstract or the project description section, the science, if you will, Rob, and that's an important component. I know in my case, I tend to focus on the budget to start with because you're looking for fatal flaws. You're trying to find those things that will help you reduce a stack of 20 or 30 to 1 or 2 that you can actually fund. And so I spend time looking at the budget, trying to determine, did you under support your project, meaning you don't have sufficient funds to do what you say you're going to do? Or did you pad it at the other end, expecting to negotiate on the back end? And from my perspective, what I try to say is ask for what you need. You know, if your budget is not realistic, then I'm going to score you down as a review panelist. Mike, what do you think?
I agree, and don't forget that you're going to have expenses in your research labs, in your companies that aren't related directly to the project costs. And you're going to have these indirect, you know, overhead expenses for your space, and you can't forget to budget all those things in as well when you're putting together a proposal. You know, I think an important thing here gets back to Rob's discussion about, you know, finding your core strategy, you know, keeping your focus, and then building a fundraising strategy around that. You know, this shiny object syndrome or chasing the next opportunity can really hurt your business. So really find that core focus and build a fundraising strategy around it, understanding that some of these smaller grants and loans are going to lead to bigger investment in the future. And so really understanding how to stage that together is important, and understanding that if you go to raise equity capital, if you've received an SBIR grant, or you've received a grant from the Biotech Center, that's going to help you get that early angel investment in the door. And if you get that early angel investment in the door, then you're more likely to bring on venture capital later if that's what you need to do. But these things happen in stages. But you don't want to solely focus on one or the other. You need to really look at all your options and have a strategy for each of those.
Mike, I'm really, really glad you brought up staging of funding. So this is true in your academic life. It's certainly true on the pre-commercialization and the commercialization side. No one writes a single check that takes you from end zone to end zone. It just doesn't happen. the folks who demonstrate a kind of a well-thought approach, that's recognized by funders, by investors, and to recognize so such and such agency, they've got a sweet spot for a certain stage of development of a product. So that's where you draw them into what hopefully would be a Gantt chart type of approach, a staging approach. Other agencies they're specific to a certain population, subset of the population demographic, whether it's a therapeutic area for disease or whatever it happens to be. To understand with some detail, the sweet spots for these and how to link those up. And I would say, much like in a research proposal, in a business plan as well, a Gantt chart is your friend. It really demonstrates it, almost a project management type of outlook that these couple of activities could be done in parallel. However, these are sequential. This one can't be begun until this other one happens. And then overlay on top of that where the money's going to come from for any one of those activities. That demonstrates clarity of thought, and a funder and investor will recognize that and respect that.
And on your corporate and foundation grant applications, more often than not, there is going to be a section in that proposal where you are asked to say, who else have you sought funding from? And it needs to be spelled out where else you're looking for the money.
Think about this, and again, from my perspective in the work that I do, there are a lot of proposals that I see that have very creative, unique, innovative, budget on target. I could name a whole bunch of characteristics, but the bottom line is that they're very solid proposals, but they miss one element, in my opinion, and I would like to seek your input on how valuable you think this one element is, and that is however else you might want to describe it, it ultimately is a deliverable. What's the product that you have out of this? What's the outcome? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not associated with a measure of some kind, but what is it that you're going to achieve as a result of this? And if it's just broader appreciation for something, that certainly has value. But in many of the agencies that I work with, that what they're looking for is what's the outcome? What's the product that results? And in particular with DoD, there has to be an end goal.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, it always comes back to who's your customer, what's the problem, what need are you solving, and what are the benefits of your technology, and how do you do it better than the leading competitor. That always, no matter what you're doing, has to be in the back of your mind all the time, and it's iterative, so that's always changing based on what your customer's telling you.
Sure.
The big buzzword in corporate and foundation today is impact. What is your impact? How many people are you going to impact? And they're going to go to that section before they go to many others. They want to know, what they're getting for their money, the return on investment, and we help faculty tell that story in the language of the funder.
Excellent. Rob?
Thanks. The vast majority of the time, a single grant isn't going to take you to a marketable product. With that in mind, there's not a deliverable in the sense of a product per se, but you want to demonstrate to a funder or to an investor the value of this project, and that might be feasibility, proof of concept. In the drug development world, it might be some data that relates to preclinical development. You're an immunologist and you have the basis for what might be a pediatric vaccine. No one's going to touch that with a 10-foot pole until you can show them squeaky clean gene toxicity data, because this is likely to be chronically administered to pediatric patients, different than an Alzheimer's drug. If you can show that builds value. It de-risks your opportunity, even in some incremental fashion, but it's a tangible thing, and therefore you build value and think of putting together a series of grants and creating your own kind of syndicate of investors, that each investment, each grant, each project takes you one inflection point in time. We call them value inflection points, and basically they're points of de-risking. This opportunity, they're all risky by definition, but to the extent that you can chip away at that and show an investor, show a funder that's how this has been parlayed, their investment has been parlayed. That's impact for them, it's certainly impact for you, and it just helps develop the story.
Excellent. And one more thing I'll say is, even if it's perfect, even if it is a perfect proposal, you may not get the funding. I mean, the cards are stacked against you in a lot of cases. So persistence, finding ways to bootstrap, to continue to work on your story, to refine the way you communicate that story, sticking with it will pay off in the long run.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo that. We've done surveys on faculty and find that after the first rejection, resubmission rates are very low. And we do everything possible to turn that around and to encourage resubmissions, because in fact the rate of acceptance in resubmissions is usually higher with the agencies, or at least that's our findings.
Well, a number of our grant programs have resubmission opportunities built in if not funded the first time around. There is no quicker way to get a second rejection than to provide no evidence that you even paid attention to the feedback that reviewers or our internal due diligence has offered you. If you're not going to respond to that, boy, that really sabotages your opportunity right there. There's a lot of pretty smart people who spend time, considering what you've got, and certainly you want to honor that. Not necessarily you have to accept everything, but you at least want to be responsive.
That's absolutely true. You want to pay attention to the review and respond to it. Well, I'd like to thank you, and Marty, should we turn it back over to you?
Thank you. I think it was a great discussion here, and what's fascinating to me is I think among our scholarly faculty, they may have heard some terms that they're not really accustomed to, and thinking in ways like a business person. I know it's a bit of a foreign concept. We heard about bootstrapping a little bit. How can you do some of these things with the smallest amount of money just to get it moving forward? And you might do that with internal funds, maybe some departmental funds, or funds through the college or the research division. We heard a little bit about return on investment. I don't know if you hear that much in your scholarly kinds of work. Value proposition. These are all business terms that we banter around quite frequently, but I have a sense that these federal agencies are looking for the same kind of thing. So I appreciate you bringing up all of these things. One of the things that I've noticed going forward in my years in the field is there is a transition going on. Moving from basic science certainly is very good, but there's a greater interest in translational. And I'm just sort of curious about what you're seeing in your sphere of influence.
Well, corporate and foundation almost always is translational. How are you going to have the greatest impact for the greatest number of people? You take, for example, the Golden Leaf Foundation. Golden Leaf Foundation is there to provide jobs. If you go to the Golden Leaf Foundation, you're going to have to show on a spreadsheet, they call it their project management plan, and you're going to have to show how each stage of your project leads to more jobs. And at the end of that grant, how many jobs will you have produced by the end of that project? Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust has moved from when I got here 15 years ago to funding just about any project you could think of that helped the financially needy get access to health care. They have narrowed that focus so much that now they're funding projects in the communities, and the only way the university is going to get a grant is if they work with those community partners to impact health care in those communities. So it's very translational. in nature.
I would argue the same thing from a federal perspective, and I think it's a question of semantics in some cases, and where you use the word translational, I think that you're more apt to hear a product, or in the case of many of the agencies now, it's all about deliverables. So how can you take what you've learned and apply it in some way that if it's educational, it becomes a module, and then that allows NSF to distribute that model beyond the scope of your program. So I think in many cases, it's embedded in the thought process of many of the agencies. You may just use different words to describe the word translational.
Well, the Biotech Center for years did fund more mechanistic, basic research where the line to eventual tangible outcomes of the research could be a fairly dotted line. That's not the case anymore for us. It's not the case anymore for most funding agencies. We really want to see a solid connection between what you're doing and how this could evolve into something that solves problems. The purpose of a project being to grow knowledge in a particular area is a laudable thing. It's why a lot of us got involved in as scientists. That just isn't enough. The good news is that there are a lot of resources to help you think through and put some parameters around what sort of opportunities might exist for your innovation. Marty's crew in particular is very strong in that regard. There are other on-campus resources. There are always interns looking at doing projects. We do the same at the Biotech Center. We've got a wonderful library that's dedicated to the business of biotechnology where you can get some market research done, some competitive intelligence. Who else is developing something in the same place? Who's investing in those things? Those resources are out there, and there are business students, there are postdocs looking at getting a taste of the dark side, whatever it is, to kind of help you explore some of those. And the SBTDC, Mike's organization, also has some of those resources in-house. And those are available to you for pennies on the dollar, if not for free.
Let me move on to my next question that Mike will probably be able to join in that conversation. But I have a question here related to the importance of teams when developing a research program. So in the areas that you work in, how important is that to the funder, whether it's federal or private or nonprofit or whatever, and what are funders looking for in a team? Maybe, Mike, you can start.
So I think in the context of funding from federal agencies with SBIR and STTR, they're going to be looking for a couple of different elements in that mix of team members. So they'll be looking for, first and foremost, someone who has the research background, credibility to execute on whatever goals you've laid out within the proposal. Have you had experience doing that before? Can you actually deliver on what you say you're going to do? But what's different about SBIR is obviously the award goes to a small business. And so what that means is you also need to have someone on board who can help show that you have some business credibility, that maybe has gone through the commercialization process before, or at a minimum, bring in advisors who have had that experience. In lieu of having a seasoned CEO on the team, you can achieve some of that by going out and recruiting a good business advisory board. So you have to think about it from both sides, not just solely academic or commercial.
Technology development is absolutely a team sport.
Yeah.
If you insist on holding the reins too tightly around your baby, you'll strangle it. You simply will. It's the sort of thing where the vast array of skill sets required to move something forward are beyond the internal skill set, certainly for myself, and I'm venturing to guess pretty much anywhere in the room. They're just so diverse, and it's on the commercial side, it's on the regulatory side, it's on the intellectual property side, it's certainly on the investment side. and not the least of which the technology side. There are just so many folks that have to be involved, and usually that's a phased approach that you know, if you insist on calling the shots from start to finish, you'll almost certainly die a pretty slow, languishing sort of death. Our grant programs at the Biotech Center, so in our Science and Technology Development Shop, all 4 of the grant programs that are based in that shop require collaborations of some sort. One is it requires an array of users and preferably multidisciplinary research projects. This is an instrumentation grant. Our 2 grants focused on kind of early commercialization efforts require a commercialization advisor in addition to kind of baked into the research project. The other is a grant to a tech transfer office that requires contact with a company that has indicated some interest in licensing the technology, and feedback from them. So there's a partnership right there. And lastly, we have a grant that funds industry academic collaboration. So by title, that's a partnership. This is a team sport.
And I would say with corporations and foundations, 2 quick points. Corporations and foundations don't want you to do things to people, they want you to do things with people. So you're going to have to involve your communities, and they will ask you who your community partners are and what kind of feedback did you get from the community in order to do the project you're doing. So again, to your point, I mean, they don't want you to do this in isolation just to, you know, pad your portfolio or be able to advance your research.
Well, they know their money isn't going to be enough to take you to a successful outcome, that if you're totally dependent upon them, there's, you know, you're not going to get there, and therefore, you know, we as a funder can't check a success story box as we are required to do.
There may be a slightly different way to think about it from a federal perspective too. During this time when there are great budget restraints, there's a sequester, there are other vehicles to reduce budgets. Federally, I find that more and more of the friends that I have, like at the National Science Foundation, for example, are very interested in collaboratives. And it's not just because the collaborative is useful in pulling together or filling gaps that you may not have as an investigator, as much as it is, now this is from a broader perspective, but it's spreading the wealth out over a broader group of people, and you hear that more and more.
This has been a great discussion. I appreciate you all being here. Unfortunately, not only are we out of time, we've gone over time. So if you have questions that we didn't get to, please stay, because we're going to have some discussions at each of the tables. So please join me in thanking our panelists today for joining us today. Before we move on to the next one, I do want to give a shout out to our sponsors, to the Division of Research and Economic Development. Thank you for supporting this program. To the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, Mark Phillips, thank you very much for continuing your strong support of the Idea to Impact Forum. We've got many other offices who are good resources here to help you go through many of these kinds of thought processes. The School of Business has been outstanding, working with us on entrepreneurship and things. The Small Business Technology Development Center, the Entrepreneurial Initiative, many, many more resources are available here on this campus to help you with these things.